London, winter 1939. An officer taps his pencil against white teeth and laughs. 28-year-old physicist Reginald Victor Jones stands at the front of a War Office briefing room claiming German bombers follow invisible radio beams to British factories at night. A chuckle rolls from the back. Radio beams? They spread and blur. The Earth curves. Physics doesn't work that way, Doctor. Air marshals and senior scientists sit around polished oak brass buttons, catching weak light through frosted windows. Commanders of Britain's air defence who've spent months dismissing wireless guidance as fantasy while cities burn. Jones clutches 3 intercepted documents. They've given him 15 minutes. The gap is humiliating. A sandy-haired university man with a folder facing the men who control squadrons, radar stations and every searchlight from Dover to Edinburgh. What the officer tapping his pencil doesn't know. Within weeks, an Avro Anson, with a shop-bought radio receiver, will trace those beams, dots on one side, dashes on the other, a pure, steady tone down the centre, pointing straight to the Rolls-Royce factory at Derby. The tone proves the beams exist, the beams prove Jones was right, the pencil tapper becomes the fool. The question isn't whether the beams are real. It's whether Jones can prove it before the next raid turns another factory to rubble. Jones lays down 3 pieces of paper. First, an intercept note from a German training network with words about beam flying and devices called Knickebein and X-Gerät. Second, a photo of a crashed bomber's radio panel, unfamiliar boxes, odd cabling, a switch stenciled with a letter British sets don't use. Third, a pilot report from an RAF man who flew over the Ruhr and heard strange audio pulses in his headset. Dots in one place, dashes in another. It's a railway line in the sky, Jones says. That night, cold air hisses in a cockpit. An Avro Anson drones above the clouds, engines chugging. The navigator wedges a shop-bought receiver into a wooden frame, wires snaking to an improvised loop antenna taped to the window. Headphones on, he hears dots on one side, dashes on the other. Slide slightly left, all dashes, slide right, all dots, hold the centre and the world turns into a steady, pure tone as if a cello note has been strung between Germany and the Midlands. He traces a line on his map with a pencil. The line points toward Derby. By morning, the Anson crew brings back their pencil line proof. Jones stands at the map and rests a finger on the crossing. Rolls-Royce Merlin works at Derby. Right under it, a senior officer's eyebrows lift. "We can hear them now," Jones says. The signals colonel who stopped laughing speaks. "If there's a line in the sky, we'll find a way to bend it." The guidance runs at familiar audio frequencies, tones around 2,000 cycles per second that any musician could hum. That's how pilots find the centre. The first system operates on radio frequencies in the low 30s megahertz, while more sophisticated versions sit near 45. A bomber can hold that tone within a few hundred yards across hundreds of miles. Factories aren't vague blobs in the night anymore. A leader across the table asks, "Doctor, if you're wrong, we're wasting precious men and equipment." Jones doesn't blink. "And if I'm right, we're wasting cities." By the end of 15 minutes, Jones has won time, equipment, and the narrow-eyed curiosity of people who don't often change their minds. The first standing order goes out to crews. Fly search patterns and log any dots and dashes pairs. Requisitions follow for valves and wire. A hut gets measured out on a muddy field. The men in that hut have chapped hands and teacups gone grey from unwashed nights. A posted motto reads, "Confusion to our enemies." The men who smirked at beams have stopped smirking. A compass on a map. A pencil track running hundreds of miles. A carpenter's plumb line, perfectly straight. A steady tone keeping a bomber within a few hundred yards, close enough that a factory can be hit in darkness. On the way out of the room, a low voice. "Very well, Dr. Jones. Find your beams." In the summer of 1940, inside a hut the colour of wet cardboard, Ken Nichols sits with rolled sleeves and headphones clamped over his ears. His elbows rest on a scarred desk, eyes fixed on a meter that moves like a seismograph. The German bombing beam speaks in 2 languages, dots on one side, dashes on the other. When they overlap perfectly, a steady tone blooms in his ears. That's the center line, the invisible railway track the bombers follow to their targets. The hut smells of damp cordite and bitter tea. A paraffin heater clicks and sulks while two radios warm their valves until they glow like kitchen coals. Nichols leans closer, mouth slightly open, nudging a dial with his knuckle and murmuring to himself, "Steady." His job is quiet. He and his crew retransmit the German beam just slightly off frequency, introducing a small sideways pull that shifts the bomber's course without them ever knowing why. It's like repainting the centerline on a road half a meter to the left and watching a convoy drift off course without realizing a thing. A shelf in the hut holds a notebook. Loads in fields near Tamworth. Rail cutting struck instead of works. No damage at target. Reports of detonations 5 miles short. These notes come from phone calls, police, wardens, railwaymen, all reporting where bombs actually fell. None of them know a beam moved. When a senior officer asks whether turning a knob in a shed can really move a bomber over Coventry, Nichols doesn't look up. "Sir," he says, "I'm telling you I can make a good pilot hear a better lie. In quiet moments when the deception works." An operator calls out, "Hold it steady, now give him a nudge," and when confirmation comes back, allotments. Thank God. Someone cheers, though you're not supposed to cheer on duty. By late summer, these huts stop being an experiment. Group Captain Edward Addison organises 80 signals wing, setting up field stations, standardising equipment, transforming what started as a handful of sheds into an operation involving roughly 2,000 people, operators, mechanics, erectors, drivers, linemen, miles of cable, and men in greatcoats push bicycles up lanes in the dark. The German system works like this. 2 overlapping radio lobes, each aligned on a target. One carries dots, short audio pulses. The other carries dashes, longer pulses. Right in the exact middle, they blend into a continuous tone, the perfect center line. A bomber rides that tone like a train on rails toward its target. For Knickebein, finding where a second beam crosses means the crew bombs. For X-Gerät, there are additional crossbeams. One tells the crew to prepare, the next starts an automatic clock, another stops it. Speed and height calibrate the distance so bombs release at precisely the right moment. If a counter-transmitter shifts that centerline even slightly, or if the crossbeam timing is off by a fraction of a second, the bombs miss by hundreds of yards. That's the difference between a machine shop and a meadow. The British face a decision: jam loudly and let the Germans know they've been detected, or stay subtle, harvest misses and keep the advantage hidden. Jones argues for subtlety. "Make them mistrust themselves," a commander says. "But not yet. We need the advantage longer." Early November 1940, off West Bay near Bridport, a Heinkel goes into the water. Fishermen see the splash, beach patrols find wreckage, and floating among the debris is a black box that looks like a soaked suitcase. It's carried to a laboratory that smells of ozone and damp wool, placed on a scarred bench. When the case lid comes free, it hisses. Inside, valves glow dull orange when power touches them again, an oscilloscope trace wobbling to life as if the box itself were breathing. A man with a screwdriver and a cigarette leans in, hair falling across his forehead, steady hands taking their time. After a minute he says, "Wrong tone. It's not 1500. This filter sits at 2 kilocycles. One number explains an entire week of British failure. Early deception signals had assumed a different frequency, but the German designers had hidden a sharper filter inside their box. British equipment had been whispering the wrong melody. Now they know the true frequency. Another engineer pencils a diagram of the filter stage, circles a component, and mutters, "That's the throat of the thing." A difference of roughly 200 Hz between frequencies that should have been identical seems trivial to anyone untrained in radio. But at 300 miles an hour, with automatic timings based on that tone, it's hundreds of yards at the receiving end. At a laboratory bench, it's the thickness of a fingertip on a dial. Over a city, it's the difference between fire and no fire. Some German engineer, competent and proud, built a better filter, and now his excellence becomes the handle the British use to twist the system off target. What follows is a rush of retuning across all the huts. New instructions written and distributed, crystals replaced. Drivers depart with boxes wrapped in oilcloth to tiny stations on back roads. A phone call reaches Nichols's hut. You have the new tone. Confirm. He listens, smiles, and responds. Confirmed. A new note goes up on the corkboard. Do not overdo. Subtlety wins the week. On November 14th, 1940, the sirens in Coventry arrived too late. The first flares fell like daylight, breaking into pieces, and a city made of brick and rivets became a lantern. Doris Lampitt was in her mid-40s, with a nurse's hands and a warden's armband. She moved through the streets, calling to people. Take the small ones first. Keep low. Hold hands, she said, her breath like smoke and frost. Overhead, more than 500 aircraft moved in organised waves. Pathfinders marked the targets, while follow-on crews trusted those marks. The medieval cathedral's timbers went like matchsticks, its metal roof slumping as if kneeling. Inside the Air Ministry, the same night unfolded in different terms. Jones had argued for subtlety. If Britain jammed blatantly, Germany would learn fast. If Britain deceived quietly, Germany would waste effort longer. The conversation in the meeting rooms turned on necessity. They could jam, but not perfectly. And not obviously. That choice meant people would die tonight. A senior voice repeated the calculus aloud. We reveal all for tonight, and save some, or we save many more nights, by revealing less now. Maps lay on tables alongside lists of factories. A cold kettle sat ignored on a desk. Lampitt heard the cathedral bells turn to a howl when the heat reached the metal. She pushed a pram under a railway arch, then turned back toward a door glowing at the edges. Anyone inside? She called out. A man coughed from the stairs. She went in. A neighbour saw her silhouette once in the doorway, then a collapse like a sigh. She never came back out. The German bombing system was precise. The X-Gerät used 2 intersecting radio beams, one to signal the pilot, another to start an onboard clock automatically. A third beam stopped the clock. Ground charts told the crew exactly how many yards they'd travel at their current speed during that timed interval, and they released their load. The British trick was simple. Superimpose a subtle fake on the start or the stop. If the start arrived a fraction of a second early, if the stop came a hair late, the automatic release would happen early. At roughly 300 miles per hour, even a tiny timing error meant about 100 yards of lateral drift. Stack that with altitude mistakes and wind drift, and you ended up hundreds of yards off target. Not enough to miss a city entirely, enough to miss a machine shop door or a gas holder, the precise targets that kept a city's war machine running. The enemy knew they were competent. Their bombers still held formation, their pathfinders still marked as trained, and their crews still trusted their instruments. But that night the machines worked, and the results went wrong. The enemy would call it atmospherics and equipment failure. 5 days later, on November 19th, Birmingham faced a different sky. The counters were retuned and lived where they could be placed. Operators in huts rode the tone and tweaked carefully while control room phones began to ring. Short. They're short, came the reports. Bombs fell before the intended lines, tearing holes in allotments and rail cuttings instead of shop floors. A railway foreman called in to say men on the early shift were gathered in a yard gaping at craters where potatoes used to grow. A city engineer drew chalk circles around fresh holes and whispered, "Thank you," to nobody in particular. An operator said it twice that night. Short. They're short. The next morning, a senior voice held the line. They must not know. Outside a saved shop, a worker stood and said something simple as bread. We're open. Early in 1941, Alexandra Palace sat on a North London hill like a museum piece, its television mast dark and silent since the war began. Robert Cockburn, an engineer, walked the echoing halls with a clipboard and gathered a team of BBC men who'd been drafted into something none of them had trained for. He explained the setup simply. The Germans had a system that worked like a question and answer. The ground sent out a signal. The bomber's equipment answered. The ground station timed how long the answer took and calculated distance from that. But if you could insert your own false answer, delaying it or advancing it by a fraction of a second, you could move that bomber's position on their instruments. The masking beacon didn't overpower the German signal, it impersonated it so precisely they couldn't tell the difference. The team spent days calibrating the equipment. Valves warmed with a smell like hot coins. Oscillators hummed. One grey-haired BBC engineer ran his hand along a rack and left a line in the dust. He said, half to himself, that they used to show faces from up here, but now they'd show them the wrong place. Someone had taped over the brass plate that said television and written in pencil, masking. The mathematics were simple enough. Radio waves travel at roughly 186,000 miles every second, nearly instantaneous to the human ear. A millisecond delay meant a signal had travelled about 93 miles and back. A microsecond, just 93 meters. The Germans measured those tiny slices to know their range. A masking beacon would listen for the ground station's ping and reply with a false echo that the bomber's instruments would recognize and trust, but offset by microseconds that translated into miles of phantom distance. Both the dials and the ground controller would see the same consistent distance, just consistently wrong. Cockburn faced a choice: fire the system on a live raid that night against a naval base, or wait another week to be certain. He looked at the chart, the mast, the clock. "Switch on," he said. "Answer the question with a lie." That night, the German crews formed up and committed to their run. Instruments glowed green in the cockpits. The guidance seemed fair and the calculations clean. The pilot lined up on the auditory beam as the range indicator counted down towards zero. He released the bombs. They whistled down through the dark. Then came the splash, a horseshoe of white foam in black water. The shipyard remained quiet. A night watchman standing under a hoist heard thunder where the sea met the sky. In the morning, on the other side of the channel, the German debriefs blamed interference, weather, equipment failure. Crews shipped their equipment for calibration. They practiced harder. System inventors argued about atmospheric refraction. Nobody wrote the real thing. The British had spoken to them in their own language and lied so well they believed it. The ratio that wins wars was simple. One station could fool many aircraft at once. With the right offset, a perfect bomb run moved 5 miles out to sea while showing zero on all the dials. Miles away, in a dark cockpit, John Cunningham breathed metal-flavoured oxygen in very cold air. The newspapers called him "Cat's Eyes," which annoyed him because they ignored the radar operator behind him, the one who spoke in numbers like a metronome. The Beaufighter prowled the night sky. His operator's voice came steady. "Contact, steady. Range, closing. Now." Cunningham banked hard, saw a brief cigar of exhaust ahead, and pressed the button for short bursts. A twin-engine shape fell away into the darkness. He throttled back and listened for the operator's breath. Tonight the Pathfinders weren't gods, they were mortals who could be found. The electronic war on the ground and the human war in the air had braided together into one thing. Cunningham would become an ace in this work. 80 Signals Wing, once just borrowed huts with makeshift equipment, now ran a network of roughly 2,000 personnel across the region. A single mast on a hill could move the zero on a stranger's instrument by miles. A fighter section might fly 3 to 5 hours in a freezing night to earn one moment when everything lines up and the interception happens. Britain now spoke the enemy's language better than the enemy did. These underdogs with huts and borrowed gear had climbed to the place where they could make the other side's own excellence serve British purposes. The beam war in Britain's skies had tipped. Dawn somewhere in England, 1941. Frost laces the hut roof. Ken Nichols takes off the headphones. His hands have stopped shaking. He writes on a pad. All quiet. A kettle ticks. Outside, a bicycle bell rings. Across the channel, crews fill out forms. Guidance unreliable, possibly affected by weather. Equipment requires recalibration. A pathfinder tells a friend, it felt right. It just wasn't. In London, Jones leaves a meeting. A senior voice says, "You've given us something precious. Time to rebuild. Time to prepare." A single civilian TV mast, broadcasting at about 45 megahertz, shifted the meaning of zero for many aircraft at once. An organisation that began in a handful of huts grew to nearly 2,000 people, operators, engineers, linemen, enough to run a lattice that touched every raid. The difference between a guess in the lower frequencies and a precise measurement, 500 Hz higher, turned a city's fate in 1 week, Coventry first, Birmingham next. The enemy was not foolish. The enemy was fooled by intent. Their excellence, calibrated boxes, disciplined crews became the lever. The more perfectly they built, the more perfectly someone could turn them around. The British chose quiet and sly over loud and proud. The decision comes down to pressure one last time. Keep broadcasting lies and risk being found out, or go dark and keep the secret for later. Some sets click off after each raid. Others continue their whisper. Headphones down, switches left, doors locked. At the beginning, confident men said beams couldn't possibly guide a bomber in the dark. Then a young physicist drew a line to Derby, which operators bent, which engineers opened, a soaked black box retuned and retooled. A city burned. 5 days later, a city was spared. A TV mast learned to lie. Bombs fell into salt water, while instruments said everything was fine. The enemy's best were missing more often. Jones, a few years later, would tug at another thread, rockets on a Baltic coast. That's another story. This one ends with the click of a switch, a pad that says, all quiet. A war won with math, with ears, and with the humility to let the other side keep talking.